The knock on my car window came at 2:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I've been staring at the clock on my phone, watching the battery drain down to 11%, trying to decide if I should use the last of it to call my daughter or just let it die. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 weeks. I didn't know what I'd say. The flashlight hit me square in the face before I could sit up straight. My neck was already stiff from the way I'd been folded against the door, using my old Carhartt jacket as a pillow. 63 years old and sleeping in the front seat of a 2009 Ford Ranger in a Walmart parking lot in Cookeville, Tennessee. There are things you never imagine about yourself. That was one of them. I put my hand up against the light and squinted. The officer was young, couldn't have been more than 28, with that careful, neutral expression they must teach at the academy. His hand rested near his belt, but not on it, cautious, not aggressive. I rolled the window down. "Sir," he said. "You all right?" "Just resting," I told him. My voice came out rougher than I expected. I hadn't talked to anyone in 2 days. "Have you been drinking tonight?" "No, sir, I don't drink." He looked past me into the cab. Empty coffee cups, a plastic bag from Dollar General with some crackers and a jar of peanut butter. My duffel bag in the back seat with everything I owned folded inside it. He'd seen this before. You could tell by the way his face didn't change. "Can I see your license and registration?" I handed them over. My hands were steadier than I expected. He walked back to his cruiser. I watched in the side mirror. He sat there longer than I thought was normal. Then he got on his radio. Then he sat some more. When he came back, his whole manner was different. Slower, more deliberate, like someone who'd just been told something and was still processing it. "Sir," he said, "can you step out of the vehicle for me? Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the years before it. My name is Owen Pressler. I was a civil engineer for 31 years, mostly working infrastructure projects for the state of Tennessee. Bridges, drainage systems, highway overpasses. It's not glamorous work. Most people don't know your name unless something falls down. But I was good at it, methodical, patient. I liked problems that had a right answer if you were willing to work long enough to find it. I married my wife when I was 26 and she was 24. We had 32 years together. I won't say they were all good years because that wouldn't be honest. There were stretches, especially after our son left for college and the house got quiet, where we seemed to be living alongside each other more than with each other. But I loved her. I believed she loved me. I believed we were the kind of couple who'd figure out the quiet years and come out the other side. I found out I was wrong on a Tuesday afternoon in October 3 years ago. I came home from a site visit outside of Crossville to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a man I recognized from her office Christmas party. His name was Donovan. He was a real estate attorney. He was wearing a sport coat and had his briefcase open in front of him like this was a business meeting, which I suppose it was. My wife looked at me and said, "I've already spoken with Donovan about the division of assets. I think it's better if you hear the terms directly." I stood in my own kitchen in my steel-toed boots with dried mud on the cuffs of my work pants, and I heard a man I barely knew tell me what was going to happen to everything I'd spent 31 years building. She wanted the house. She got it. It was worth $340,000, and we paid it off 6 years prior. She wanted half my retirement account. She got $187,000 out of my 401k. She wanted the lake property we'd bought together in 2009, 4 acres out near Center Hill. Her attorney had already arranged for it to be listed before I even knew we were divorcing. What I got? My truck, my tools, $14,000 from a joint savings account, and 30 days to remove my belongings from the house. I didn't fight it. That's the thing I have to live with. I was so stunned, so completely unable to believe this was happening, that I just sat with a county court-appointed attorney for 2 appointments and signed what he told me to sign. He billed me $800 and told me the settlement was within normal range. I found out 8 months later from my daughter that Donovan and my ex-wife had been together for over a year before she filed. I was 61 years old, starting over from $14,000 with a truck and a duffel bag. The engineering firm I'd worked for had downsized the previous spring. I was on a month-to-month contract. When the divorce became public knowledge through the small-town machinery that grinds everything eventually, the contract wasn't renewed. I was told it was budget-related. I was told a lot of things that year. For 7 months, I rented a room in a boarding house outside of Sparta. I picked up freelance inspection work where I could find it. Then, the man who ran the boarding house sold the building and I had 2 weeks' notice. The freelance work had dried up. My savings, what was left of them, had gone to the room, to food, to the $800 attorney, to a few months of Cobra health insurance before I let it lapse. The Walmart parking lot in Cookville was month 3 of living in the truck. I'd found a routine. I used the Walmart bathroom to wash up in the mornings. I bought the cheapest food I could find. I drove to the library during the day to use the Wi-Fi and search for work. I'd applied for 37 jobs in 4 months. I was a 62-year-old civil engineer with 3 decades of experience, and I could not get a single interview. I told myself every day that this was temporary. I told myself that on good days and bad ones. I told myself that when it was 40 degrees and I couldn't run the truck heater because I was watching the gas gauge. I told myself that when I saw a man my age at the library with his grandchildren looking at picture books together and I had to get up and walk outside because something happened in my chest that I couldn't let anyone see. That was the life I was living when the officer knocked on my window. I got out of the truck. My back cracked when I straightened up. The officer wasn't alone anymore. There was a second cruiser parked 20 feet behind his and a second officer standing next to it. Older, a sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. Both of them were watching me with that same careful, processed look. "Mr. Pressler," the young one said, "I need to ask you some questions. You're not under arrest. You don't have to answer, but I'd appreciate it if you would." "All right," I said. "Can you tell me your mother's full name, including her maiden name?" I blinked. "Ruth Ann Pressler. Born Ruth Ann Colby." Something moved across his face. He looked back at the sergeant. "And your father's name, Leonard Dale Pressler. He passed in 1991. The sergeant stepped forward. He was in his 50s, heavyset, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He said, "Mr. Pressler, when your father passed, do you know how his estate was handled?" "Not entirely," I said. I was starting to feel the cold more, or maybe it was something else. "He died when I was 31. My mother handled everything." There wasn't much to handle, I thought. He worked construction his whole life. Small house in Baxter's, some tools, an old truck. "Did you know your father owned land?" "No, sir," I said. "Not beyond the lot the house sat on." The sergeant looked at the young officer again. Then he looked at me for a long moment, like he was deciding something. "Mr. Pressler," he said, "I think you need to make a phone call in the morning to the Putnam County Register of Deeds office and to an attorney." "I don't have an attorney," I said. "I'd suggest getting one," he said, "first thing tomorrow." He handed me a piece of paper. It had a case number written on it and below it 2 phone numbers. "There's a federal hold on a land record in your name," he said. "Has been since 2003. It looks like it was never resolved because no one could locate you as the registered co-owner. You should have been notified years ago." He paused. "Whoever handled your father's estate or didn't, there are some questions that need answering." I stood in a Walmart parking lot at 2 in the morning with a piece of paper in my hand, and I didn't say anything for a long time. "Sir," the young officer said, "are you all right?" "I genuinely don't know," I said. "My father was not a complicated man. He worked hard, kept to himself, went to church on Sundays, and died of a heart attack at 67 while he was cleaning gutters. He never talked about money. He never talked about much except weather and whether the Vols were going to have a decent season. What I learned in the 6 weeks after that parking lot was that my father had been more complicated than I knew. In 1987, 4 years before he died, he had purchased 23 acres of land in White County, Tennessee, undeveloped timberland. He paid $31,000 for it in cash, money I still don't fully understand where it came from, though my daughter found a reference in some old papers to a life insurance payout from his own father that he'd never mentioned to anyone. He registered the land jointly in his name and mine, making me co-owner. I was 27 years old. He never told me. When he died in 1991, the land didn't go through probate properly. My mother, God rest her, was overwhelmed and trusted the whole matter to a local attorney who apparently did the minimum and filed the minimum. The house sold. The truck sold. The tools went to my brother. The 23 acres sat in a county record with 2 names on it, Leonard Dale Pressler, deceased, and Owen Dale Pressler, address unknown, and nothing happened for years. Then, in 2003, a federal geological survey identified the White County land as containing viable mineral deposits, specifically a vein of zinc sulfide ore that ran underneath several adjacent properties. A mining consortium began acquiring land in the area. When they got to my father's 23 acres, they found the ownership dispute, a deceased co-owner and a living one no one could locate, and the federal process for resolving it generated a flag in the county system, a flag that sat there for 20 years waiting. I had been findable the entire time, of course. I'd had a driver's license, a tax record, a professional engineering license, a registered vehicle. The flag existed in one system. I existed in another. The 2 systems never talked to each other until that officer ran my name in that Walmart parking lot in Cookville at 2 in the morning. The attorney I found, a woman named Patricia Lund, who worked out of a small office in Cookville and had been recommended by the sergeant, told me the situation plainly on the first visit. She did not charge me for that first meeting, which I appreciated more than I could say. The 23 acres had been under an option agreement with the mining consortium since 2019. They'd been paying holding fees into an escrow account while the ownership question sat unresolved. Those fees, accumulated over 4 years with the applicable interest, came to $94,000. The land itself, based on current mineral rights valuations and the active survey data, was appraised at $1.1 million. I sat in Patricia's office in a shirt I'd washed in a Walmart bathroom sink, and I listened to her say those numbers out loud, and I felt nothing at first, just a kind of ringing. Then I felt something crack open in my chest, not in a good way, in the way of something that had been held closed for a very long time. I excused myself and went to the bathroom in her hallway and sat on the floor with my back against the wall for about 4 minutes. I'm not ashamed of that. A man is allowed 4 minutes. The legal process took another 4 months. There were hearings, there were documents, there was a deposition about my father's estate and the original attorney, long retired, living in Florida, who had failed to properly notify me of my co-ownership. Patricia handled most of it. I showed up when I needed to show up and answered what I needed to answer. During those 4 months, I was not sleeping in my truck. Patricia had connected me with a nonprofit that provided transitional housing for working adults in hardship. I had a small room in a shared house in Cookville. I had a bed and a door that locked. I was not used to how grateful a person could feel for a door that locked. I also got a call from a civil engineering firm in Nashville. One of their project managers had found my resume online, the one I'd posted 8 months earlier and assumed no one had read, and wanted to talk. I told him my situation honestly. He offered me a part-time consulting contract to start. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The work felt like drinking water after a drought. I'd forgotten how much I needed to be useful with something. The escrow funds released in February, the land sale finalized in April. I remember sitting at Patricia's conference table while the title company representative explained the final disbursement. The mining consortium's representatives were on a conference call, professional and impersonal, the way large business transactions always are. When it was done, I walked out into a gray afternoon with a certified check in my hand, and I sat in my truck. My old truck with the peeling weather stripping and the cracked dashboard, and I held that check, and I thought about my father cleaning gutters. I thought about him buying 23 acres of land in 1987 and writing both our names on the deed and never saying a word about it to me. Not once in the 4 years between then and when he died. I don't know what he was thinking. I'll never know what he was thinking. I'll never know. Maybe he meant to tell me someday. Maybe he thought I'd figure it out. Maybe he was just a quiet man who showed his love in paperwork nobody found for 30 years. I cried in that truck. I won't pretend I didn't. The total came to just under $1.2 million after Patricia's fees, after the estate attorney fees, after the taxes I set aside on her advice. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I've seen what money does to people when they're not ready for it. And I was not sure I was ready for it. I didn't go buy anything for 3 weeks. I just kept going to the consulting job and sleeping in my room in the shared house and thinking. The first thing I did was call my daughter. We talked for 2 hours. I told her everything. The parking lot, the officer, the land, my father's name on that deed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Daddy, why didn't you call me when things got bad?" I didn't have a good answer for that. The honest one was that I was ashamed, that I had spent 60 years being the person who handled things, and I couldn't figure out how to be the person who needed help. I'm working on that. The second thing I did was buy a house. Nothing grand. A 3-bedroom craftsman in a small town outside of Cookeville with a covered porch and a yard that needs work. The kind of house my parents would have recognized. I paid cash, which felt surreal. And then I sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and watched a red-tailed hawk circle over the tree line for 20 minutes. The third thing, and this is the part I think about most, I set up a trust, not for myself, for 2 things. 1, a scholarship fund at the community college in Cookeville for students in the trades and technical fields. My father was a construction worker. I was an engineer. The distance between those 2 things was education, and not everyone gets the chance. 2, a small grant fund for people in transitional housing in Putnam County, administered through the nonprofit that had given me a bed when I needed one. The woman who ran that organization, when I told her, sat very still for a moment and then said, "We don't get many of these." I said, "I imagine not. I haven't been back to Walmart since. I mean that practically, not as some kind of statement. There's a Kroger closer to the house, and I like it better. But sometimes I drive past that parking lot on my way through town, and I see the exact spot, 3rd row from the entrance, near the cart return, and I think about the officer with the flashlight. I tracked him down. His name is Thomas, and he works the overnight shift out of the Cookeville precinct. I went by the station one afternoon and asked if I could speak with him, and they looked at me a little sideways, but they got him. He came out in his uniform looking like he expected a complaint. I shook his hand and told him what had happened, that the record check he'd run that night, that routine thing he does 100 times a shift, had found something in my name that I didn't know existed, that it had changed things for me. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I remember you, the Ford Ranger." "That's right," I said. He nodded slowly, the way people do when something resolves into meaning that didn't have meaning before. "I'm glad you're doing better," he said. "Me too," I said. "Me too," I said. We shook hands again, and I drove home. I had a porch to sit on. I had a hawk to watch. I had 31 years of work behind me, and if I'm lucky, a few good ones ahead. My father bought 23 acres of land and put my name on it and never told me. Maybe he knew something I didn't. Maybe he just wanted me to have something solid to stand on when everything else gave way. Turns out I did. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened to me, not just the losing, the divorce, the job, the truck, the parking lot, but the whole arc of it. The way things collapsed and then, years later, in the most unlikely place, at the most unlikely hour, started to come back together. And I keep returning to the same thought. None of it was random. Not in a mystical sense. I'm not talking about fate or signs or the universe arranging things. I mean something more practical than that. I mean that causes have effects, and effects take time to arrive. And if you're patient enough, or just stubborn enough, you're sometimes still standing when they do. Donovan, my ex-wife's attorney, was so confident in what he'd taken from me that he never considered what might still be attached to my name. That's the thing about people who move fast and cut corners. They only look at what's visible. They don't check the foundation. My father put my name on 23 acres of land in 1987 in Neti Favisol, and because of that quiet, private act, there was something no divorce settlement could touch. Not because of luck, because Donovan didn't do his homework. Arrogance is its own undoing, and it usually arrives right on schedule. I think about the choices I made in the bad years too, the ones that were easy to make and the ones that weren't. I could have asked for help sooner. I could have called my daughter instead of letting the shame calcify. I chose not to, and I lived with the weight of that choice in a Ford Ranger in a Walmart parking lot, and that was the fair cost of it. Nobody handed me that hardship. I earned it the same way you earn most of your hardships, by deciding that appearances mattered more than honesty. What I kept, through all of it, was the work ethic my father gave me and the professional reputation I'd built over 31 years. Those couldn't be divided in a settlement. When the engineering firm in Nashville finally called, they called because of a resume built from 3 decades of showing up and doing the job right. Integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. But it accumulates quietly, the same way my father's land accumulated value for 30 years without anyone noticing. Patricia didn't have to waive her fee for that first consultation. She did it anyway because she was the kind of person who noticed when someone needed a door left open. Thomas didn't have to follow up on a flag in a county database for a man sleeping in a truck. He did it because that's what careful, honest work looks like. The people who helped me weren't heroes. They were just people doing their jobs with their full attention. That's rarer than it sounds, and it matters more than most of us admit. I'm 63 years old. I have a porch and a covered drive and a scholarship fund at the community college that will outlast me. I have a daughter I talk to on Sundays now. I have a hawk that hunts the tree line most mornings if I'm up early enough to watch. What I know now, that I didn't know at 61 sleeping in a parking lot, is that the ground can shift under you completely and you can still be standing when it stops. Not because you're lucky, because you kept your word, you did your work, and you didn't let the hardest years make you into someone you weren't. That's the only thing I'm certain of. The rest, you figure out as you go.